There was no intimation given that the removal of the 3D and 4th Regiments of Infantry to the western border of Louisiana was occasioned in any way by the prospective annexation of Texas, but it was generally understood that such was the case. Ostensibly, we were intended to prevent filibustering into Texas, but really as a menace to Mexico, in case she appeared to contemplate war. Generally, the officers of the Army were indifferent whether the annexation was consummated or not, but not so all of them. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war, which resulted, as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies and not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Texas was originally a state belonging to the Republic of Mexico. It extended from the Sabine River on the east to the Rio Grande on the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico on the south and east to the territory of the United States and New Mexico, another Mexican state at that time, on the north and west. An empire in territory, it had but a very sparse population until settled by Americans who had received authority from Mexico to colonize. These colonists paid very little attention to the supreme government and introduced slavery into the state almost from the start, though the Constitution of Mexico did not, nor does it now, sanction that institution. Soon, they set up an independent government of their own, and war existed between Texas and Mexico in name from that time until 1836, when active hostilities very nearly ceased upon the capture of Santa Anna, the Mexican president. Before long, however, the same people who with permission of Mexico had colonized Texas and afterwards set up slavery there, and then seceded as soon as they felt strong enough to do so, offered themselves and the state to the United States, and in 1845 their offer was accepted. The occupation, separation, and annexation were from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. Even if the annexation itself could be justified, the manner in which the subsequent war was forced upon Mexico cannot. The fact is, annexationists wanted more territory than they could possibly lay any claim to as part of the new acquisition. Texas, as an independent state, never had exercised jurisdiction over the territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Mexico had never recognized the independence of Texas and maintained that, even if independent, the state had no claim south of the Nueces. I am aware that a treaty made by the Texans with Santa Anna, while he was under duress, ceded all the territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, but he was a prisoner of war when the treaty was made, and his life was in jeopardy. He knew, too, that he deserved execution at the hands of the Texans if they should ever capture him. The Texans, if they had taken his life, would have only followed the example set by Santa Anna himself a few years before, when he executed the entire garrison of the Alamo and the villagers of Goliad. In taking military possession of Texas after annexation, the Army of Occupation, under General Taylor, was directed to occupy the disputed territory. The Army did not stop at the Nueces and offer to negotiate for a settlement of the boundary question, but went beyond, apparently in order to force Mexico to initiate war. It is to the credit of the American nation, however, that after conquering Mexico, and while practically holding the country in our possession so that we could have retained the whole of it or made any terms we chose, we paid a round sum for the additional territory taken, more than it was worth or was likely to be, to Mexico. To us, it was an empire and of incalculable value, but it might have been obtained by other means. The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times. The 4th Infantry went into camp at Salubrity in the month of May, 1844, with instructions, as I have said, to await further orders. At first, officers and men occupied ordinary tents. As the summer heat increased, these were covered by sheds to break the rays of the sun. The summer was whiled away in social enjoyments among the officers and visiting those stationed at and near Fort Jessup, 25 miles away, visiting the planters on the Red River and the citizens of Natchitoches and Grand Ecore. There was much pleasant intercourse between the inhabitants and the officers of the army. I retain very agreeable recollections of my stay at Camp Salubrity and of the acquaintances made there, and no doubt my feeling is shared by the few officers living who were there at the time. I can call to mind only 2 officers of the 4th Infantry, besides myself, who were at Camp Salubrity with the regiment, who are now alive. With a war in prospect, and belonging to a regiment that had an unusual number of officers detailed on special duty away from the regiment, my hopes of being ordered to West Point as instructor vanished. At the time of which I now write, officers in the quartermasters, commissaries, and adjutant general's departments were appointed from the line of the army and did not vacate their regimental commissions until their regimental and staff commissions were for the same grades. Generally, lieutenants were appointed to captaincies to fill vacancies in the staff corps. If they should reach a captaincy in the line before they arrived at a majority in the staff, they would elect which commission they would retain. In the 4th Infantry, in 1844, at least 6 line officers were on duty in the staff and therefore permanently detached from the regiment. Under these circumstances, I gave up everything like a special course of reading and only read thereafter for my own amusement, and not very much for that, until the war was over. I kept a horse and rode, and stayed out of doors most of the time by day, and entirely recovered from the cough which I had carried from West Point and from all indications of consumption. I have often thought that my life was saved, and my health restored, by exercise and exposure, enforced by an administrative act, and a war, both of which I disapproved. As summer wore away, and cool days and colder nights came upon us, the tents we were occupying ceased to afford comfortable quarters, and further orders not reaching us, we began to look about to remedy the hardship. Men were put to work, getting out timber to build huts, and in a very short time all were comfortably housed, privates as well as officers. The outlay by the government in accomplishing this was nothing, or nearly nothing. The winter was spent more agreeably than the summer had been. There were occasional parties given by the planters along the coast, as the bottomlands on the Red River were called. The climate was delightful. Near the close of the short session of Congress of 1844-5, the bill for the annexation of Texas to the United States was passed. It reached President Tyler on the 1st of March, 1845, and promptly received his approval. When the news reached us, we began to look again for further orders. They did not arrive promptly, and on the 1st of May following I asked and obtained a leave of absence for 20 days for the purpose of visiting St. Louis. The object of this visit has been before stated. Early in July, the long-expected orders were received, but they only took the regiment to New Orleans barracks. We reached there before the middle of the month, and again waited weeks for still further orders. The yellow fever was raging in New Orleans during the time we remained there, and the streets of the city had the appearance of a continuous, well-observed Sunday. I recollect but one occasion when this observance seemed to be broken by the inhabitants. One morning about daylight, I happened to be awake, and hearing the discharge of a rifle not far off, I looked out to ascertain where the sound came from. I observed a couple of clusters of men nearby, and learned afterwards that it was nothing, only a couple of gentlemen deciding a difference of opinion with rifles at 20 paces. I do not remember if either was killed or even hurt, but no doubt the question of difference was settled satisfactorily and honorably in the estimation of the parties engaged. I do not believe I ever would have the courage to fight a duel. If any man should wrong me to the extent of my being willing to kill him, I would not be willing to give him the choice of weapons with which it should be done, and of the time, place, and distance separating us when I executed him. If I should do another such a wrong as to justify him in killing me, I would make any reasonable atonement within my power if convinced of the wrong done. I place my opposition to dueling on higher grounds than here stated. No doubt a majority of the duels fought have been for want of moral courage on the part of those engaged to decline. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. At Camp Salubrity, and when we went to New Orleans barracks, the 4th Infantry was commanded by Colonel Vose, then an old gentleman who had not commanded on drill for a number of years. He was not a man to discover infirmity in the presence of danger. It now appeared that war was imminent, and he felt that it was his duty to brush up his tactics. Accordingly, when we got settled down at our new post, he took command of the regiment at a battalion drill. Only 2 or 3 evolutions had been gone through when he dismissed the battalion, and turning to go to his own quarters, dropped dead. He had not been complaining of ill health, but no doubt died of heart disease. He was a most estimable man, of exemplary habits, and by no means the author of his own disease.